The issue of Kiruv Rechaikim, on one hand, is among the most simplest and most elementary propositions. Certainly, if one is an Ohev Yisrael, or one tries to be an Ohev Yisrael, one wants to help bring other Jews to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the Rambam writes. That is an expression of Avas Yisrael. It is also an expression of Avas Hashem. If you love Hashem, you want to make the name of Hashem beloved among others. So the obligation of Kiruv Rechokim is a very, very obvious one. It's a very, very great imperative of our generation. So in some ways, there might be very little to talk about because, Baruch Hashem, it's such a well-known idea of how nachutz, how important, how vital it is for Klal Yisrael. People often quote the Zohar HaKadosh. The Zohar HaKadosh says there are 600,000 letters in the Sefer Torah, and that is mechuvan keneged the 600,000 souls that left Mitzrayim, and therefore each Jewish soul has its letter in the Sefer Torah. And people ask a kasha, it's a well-known kasha, that the Torah does not have 600,000 letters. The Torah has around 325,000 letters, so it's way beyond the margin of error. And one of the terutzim that is given is that in reality, in the Sefer Torah in Shemayim, even the spaces between letters also have letters. But those are covered up, those are invisible, we don't see them. But when we bring a neshama to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we're megala their letter in the Sefer Torah in Shemayim, we are mashlim the Sefer Torah, and the Sefer Torah that's chaser eisachas is puzzle. So too, until we're mashlim those letters, our own Sefer Torah is puzzle. So all of this is, again, relatively pashut, well understood, and Baruch Hashem, the very fact that you're here shows that you understand the nechitzos, you understand the importance. At the same time, of course, you also understand that in order to be a makarev, one has to continuously work on their own aliyah in Torah. There's a klal in Yeridea, Aidi detriti lemiflet lebala, which in Hilchos Melicha means if something is busy giving out, it's iser, it does not absorb, and some have applied it b'derech drush to the person who is so interested in being mashpia on other people that they themselves are no longer growing in their Yiddishkeit. Well, if it's triti lemiflat, you're giving out, you're not being baileya. So I think Ben Torah understands that side by side with my achrayas towards others, I have to continuously work in myself, grow in my own learning, otherwise I become stale, otherwise I become burned out, otherwise I literally don't have anything to give because there's nothing in me that continues to grow. So it's a difficult shikul. Every person has to create a particular balance, and it's not an all or nothing. You grow by your being mashpia on other people, but at the same time, you also have to have time and energy to concentrate on your own spiritual growth, your own learning, and the like. But what I want to talk about is I want to talk about what might be called, on some level, the second stage of Kiruv Rechaikim, which, again, this is not even a chiddush of mine at all. This has been identified over a very long period of time. And that is, we've done a pretty good job on the entry level, meaning taking people who are not religious, not shomer mitzvahs, exposing them to the beauties of Torah, the beauties of learning, and Baruch Hashem, they become b'nei Torah, they become committed to mitzvahs and the like. Obviously, there's a lot more to accomplish. We certainly cannot say we've reached everybody. Obviously, we have not reached everybody, and even on that entry level, there's a tremendous amount of work that has to be done. One has to be very, very careful not to be complacent, not to be overconfident. At the same time, it is important that the Kiruv Velt give itself a little bit of a pat on the back to have chizuk that indeed they've done a lot, and b'ezras Hashem, there's a lot more to do. But one has to understand that the initial issue of making somebody from, whatever that means exactly, is not at all the end of the process. Sometimes, one of the Yetzer Haras that we have in the Jewish outreach world is a little bit of the numbers games. And indeed, and in some way, that's externally forced upon us by funding and various other political issues like that. But the issue is we raise our success by how many people, we've made from, how many people we've changed. And as soon as we've made you from, we move you down the assembly line. You're out of our ambit. We check the box. And now we got to bring in new blood, new flesh, new people to make those titles, to make those numbers. Like the Indians used to count when they used to give people, I forget the word now, when they used to when they used to cut off when they would kill somebody's scalp, right? How many scalps they would have in their belt. And the problem is, Balei Tshuva, Baruch Hashem, don't just die. They grow up, and they get married, and they have kids, and they have families. And there's a whole bunch of new types of problems that have to be dealt with. Someone who didn't come from a religious family and doesn't necessarily have that many connections in the religious world. There are going to be issues. How do I raise my children? What types of hashkafas? Even in dating. What do I look for? How do I establish shalom bayis? How do I communicate with my wife, with my spouse? How much time do I spend with my children? Things that might be naturally understood by a person who is raised in a certain milieu, certain things you just pick up. To a Baal Tshuva, to a Chozer B'Tshuva. All of this can be very, very new. And very often, we kind of neglect the issues that people face once they are religious, because we've gotten them already. We can move them down and then concentrate on some new people. And this has been called, the problem of second stage kiruv and the like, and it's a very, very serious issue. To give people the tools to deal not just with Yiddishkeit, but to deal with life, which of course is ultimately the same thing. Shalom bayis, time with your children. For example, to give you an example, sometimes when people become overly mechanical, like somebody once asked me, how many minutes should I talk to my wife a week? Now, I could answer that question, but I think there's a certain problem, mitzidenu, why such a question would be asked. Meaning, why wouldn't there be an intuitive understanding? Why doesn't the person absorb the idea of Chazal? Oava kegufa. You must love your wife like you love yourself. Mechabda yoser migufa. So, this is an issue that I think all Makarvim have to face, and that is, on one hand, we do some things very, very, very good. We show people the mesikas of Torah, the sweetness of Torah, how learning a sugya b'iyun gives you a sense of connection to the Ribono Shel Olam, how it engages your mind. And those are things that, Baruch Hashem, we do very, very well. Even that, I'll get a little later, may not work for everybody either, but b'derech klal, this is a mahalech of as the Yerushalmi says, ha'ma'or sheba machziru l'mutav. The light of the Torah can have tremendous, tremendous ways of bringing a person to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And we know this, it's axiomatic in the derech of our Messiah, that even if you're learning a sugya that has nothing to do with a spiritual context, you're learning about the Shor Shenagach HaSapara, you're learning about Shlichus Yad, you're learning about Ganavim and Gazlanim, and people say, where is the spirituality to that? And superficially, maybe there is nothing that you can identify as spiritual. But we believe, and this is our Messiah, that connecting yourself to the mind of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the intricacies of a Taisvus, in the complexities of Rabbi Akiva Eiger at a more advanced level, or of Rav Chaim, you taste spirituality. We do that, Baruch Hashem, very, very well. But at the same time, Kashem that we say everything's in the Torah. But on the other hand, the Chazon Ish, perhaps from the Torah itself, was able to figure out how to do brain surgery. Could be. But on the other hand, a regular brain surgeon who said, I just went to yeshiva for 10 years and, I'll do the brain surgery, we wouldn't necessarily trust. So too, Hagam, that everything is in the Torah and everything comes from the Torah. But without directly focusing on inyanim of shalom bayis, how to raise children, most people, the average person, will not mimela get that hadracha from the abstract learning of Torah. Now you could say, while the person is unmarried, while the person is nebacher, right, maybe the time is to give him the foundation in Torah. But there is going to come a time, and we actually hope sooner rather than later, in which a person has a mishpacha, and a person has to know how to deal with these things. And especially when they don't have a family connection necessarily in different ways. They're not well connected to a broader community. And thus we find, even among B'nai Torah, Baruch Hashem, who have been choser b'tshuva, we find divorces, we find lack of shalom bayis, we find difficulties in raising children. Now, obviously, nobody can ever make the claim, and we have to be careful not to overpromise, become from and you'll have a wonderful marriage and all your kids will be perfect. Doesn't always work that way. But still, many people do feel adrift, and sometimes they even describe it, although this is a very harsh way of describing it, as feeling betrayed. They feel they signed up for a certain regimen, and they thought certain things would follow from those commitments, and those things didn't follow. People tell me, for example, against Mishunadic story, that they heard many, many shmuzin about how empty the secular world is, how decadent it is, how selfish it is, how none of the marriages are good. So a person told me, and again, it's a shrekliche story, and it's a mitzvah liyashev. She described how difficult her life was. She became a choseres b'tshuva. She married a choser b'tshuva. And with great, great mesiras nefesh, they strive to create a home. And unfortunately, they have many, many different problems of all of a different magnitude. And she described to me her sister, who is not religious, very nice person, beautiful family, all the kids are doing well. And when the sister asks her sometimes, like, why did you make the decision to be religious? And the woman initially would kind of say, well, the secular world aren't good families, aren't good marriages, and aren't good. And she couldn't say it anymore because she's talking to somebody who on the other side did achieve something. So where do you go? Where do you go with all of this? So this tells us is that we have to be mashlim. We can't give up on people just because they become frum and they've gone on. There needs to be a kesher, there needs to be a hiskashrus, there needs to be a notion of giving people chizuk and kiruv, not to take them from being non-religious to being religious, but to understand how to live the life of a Jew within the framework of Torah. And that is really a second level chachma. That's a chachma that may go beyond what we do in the Kaisley Beis HaMedrash. And as I say, there are many, many people that have a great feeling of betrayal in this way. Again, I don't want to be a downer or pessimistic, but I guess on a day of Shiva Zerbatam, a day of Atainus, it is a zman where we do make a cheshbon nefesh. And we think about the things that we do, at the same time recognizing the many, many, many wonderful accomplishments that the world of Kiruv has done and Mimir Hashem will continue to do. Let me share with you an interesting vort which may contribute to this. In a few weeks before Rosh Hashanah, we're going to read about the parsha of Esha Shafas Toar. And I'm not going to go into the pratim, but the parsha which the Torah permits a woman captured in war, a non-Jewish woman, to be taken as a wife with all sorts of conditions and the like. The Meforshim say, Al Pi the Arizal, that the whole concept of a milchama, waging a war and recapturing the Esha Shafas Toar, is a remez to the milchama of the Yetzer Hara. That when you have an enemy that tries to destroy you, it's the Yetzer Hara, and you can reclaim it. In fact, the Arizal even says, when it says she cries for her father and mother 30 days, it's a remez to the 30 days of the month of Elul, which are days of crying and bechi, and she cries for her mother for what she did to Klal Yisrael, and she cries for her father what she did to the Eibishter. And Shleishim Yaim is Chodesh Elul. And then there's a whole mahalach of tshuva. Again, I don't want to go into all of the symbolism, but the Esha Shafas Toar is seen as the struggle we have to reclaim our soul from the clutches of evil. I want to raise a technical question. Rashi discusses, is Eisha Shafas Tayar, what type of war are we talking about? There are two types of wars. There's Milchemes Mitzvah and Milchemes Rishus. Milchemes Mitzvah is the war against the 7 nations of Canaan, the war against Amalek. Milchemes Rishus is when the Sanhedrin authorizes a war of expansion. We cannot do that today, but the Sanhedrin and the Urim V'Tumim give Rishus for a war of expansion. Zakt Rashi from the Sifri, the Parsha of Yafas Tayar is not talking about Milchemes Mitzvah. Because in Milchemes Mitzvah, there are no captives. You got to kill everybody. It can only be talking about Milchemes Rishus. That's what Rashi says. So here, I want to ask a kasha. Again, to ask a kasha from Rashi and the Arizal may not be a kasha, but if you put the two together, you get a certain inconsistency. Because if I were to ask you, is the milchama against the Yetzer Hara a Milchemes Rishus or a Milchemes Mitzvah? We certainly would have characterized it as a Milchemes Mitzvah. Ein lecha Milchemes Mitzvah gadol mizeh. So isn't it a madnazach? Isn't it a very strange thing that the Torah would discuss the milchama of the Yetzer Hara in a parsha that is talking about optional wars instead of mandatory wars? And Rav Shlomo Yosef Zevin, Zechreinu Livracha, says that there's a very profound insight here. And that is, although the Milchemes HaYetzer is a Milchemes Mitzvah, tactically, you have to fight it like a Milchemes Rishus. And that is why the Milchemes Mitzvah is alluded to in the Parsha of Milchemes Rishus. How is that so? What is the nafkamina between Milchemes Mitzvah and Milchemes Rishus? Milchemes Mitzvah is you destroy the enemy. Milchemes Rishus, you can capture and subjugate the enemy. In the Milchemes HaYetzer, there are two types of tshuva a person can do. One is a tshuva that you might call amputation. A person looks at their past and they say, that was evil, it was bad. I cut myself off from it, I amputate the 10, 20, 30, or 40 years. And I act as if it doesn't exist at all. That is the tshuva of amputation, and that would be akin to a Milchemes Mitzvah, where the enemy is obliterated. Sometimes amputations are necessary, but amputations always involve a great deal of pain, loss of function, and even something called phantom pain, where after the thing is removed, it continues to bother you. The Torah's meramis, when a chayzer b'tshuva confronts the totality of their life, the optimal, healthiest model of tshuva is not a tshuva of renunciation and cutting themselves off from their past, but taking their past, capturing it, reclaiming it, elevating it, and letting that be the source of their avodah. And this manifests itself in many, many ways. People often come to the world of tshuva having many, many talents. They could have been writers, they could have been singers, musicians, poets. And there's a certain pressure, as it were, to kind of give up all of those things because you want to become Ben Torah, whatever it would be. And yet, now granted, there may be certain occupations, I don't have to mention them, in which you sometimes do have to give them up. I mean, if you were a cocaine dealer or whatever it is, we would discourage you from pursuing that. But b'derech klal, if a person has kochos, a person has abilities, his turn to Yiddishkeit shouldn't be destroying that which in himself that gave him fulfillment and joy. But like a Milchemes Rishus, you take the enemy and you capture it and you enslave it, meaning you subjugate it for a higher purpose. Same thing is true with family. People have non-religious parents, non-religious grandparents. Sometimes there's kind of a rush to say, sorry, I can't allow my children to mix with Bubby and Zadie or Saba and Savta. They're not religious. But the truth of the matter is, many people have gotten many, many good things from their families. You know, a person, in fact, the very fact that a person can become a Baal Tshuva is sometimes because they got the intellectual curiosity, the moral courage, the honesty from their parents. Their parents gave them that foundation. You know, I'll tell you, in microcosm, this is something a Rav often suffers. I remember, I tell you, it's Kadosh Baruch Hu is ma'anish mida k'neged mida. Every Rav will tell you, at least a Rav in the United States will tell you, that if they were makar of certain people who went off to yeshiva, and then they became frummer than the Rav, so when they come back, they no longer trust the Rav for anything. Now, I remember, I did it as a kid, and I've had it done to me as an adult. So I understand both sides of that equation. Many Rabbanim tell me in the States that the signs of their greatest success is when their Talmidim no longer talk to them. That's the sign that they've been totally matzliach. And again, I've been on both sides of it, unfortunately. So be careful, because if you have that attitude, it's going to happen. It's going to happen to you. Going to happen to you also. And of course, if that's true with a Rav or a posek, certainly it'll be true with parents, even from parents, and kal v'chomer, parents who are not religious, not shomer mitzvahs. But at the same time, it's part of basic hakara satayv that we recognize that our avodah came from that situation. And to put it in a more deeper way, you have to understand this. Anything that was not within the ambit of your bechira was the hashgacha of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So if a person is born into a certain family, and he had no control over that decision, and it was not a function of any choice that he made, it must be that it was the gezerah of HaKadosh Baruch Hu that a person's tikkun bedafka comes from the experiences that they had in that seviva. And instead of making believe that seviva never existed, one has to go back and see it is bedafka, that seviva. That is the basis, that is the foundation of my avodas Hashem. So, when you come to Yerushalayim and you see a 10th generation Yerushalmi, Shakua, Lagamri, and Torah, and mitzvahs, midorei, doros, hundreds and hundreds of years. And you come from North Dakota, and you've been frum for 6 months, and you say, what am I? I could never be that. They have something that I could live 1,000 years, and I wouldn't have. That is true. They have a precious, wonderful gift that you'll never have. But here is the thing. You also have a precious, wonderful gift that they'll never have. The Eibishter put some people in South Dakota because they needed to go through South Dakota. They needed to go through. Again, what a person does when he's a Baal Bechira, that's his cheshbon. That's not necessarily Hashem's gezerah. But if I was born as a child in a certain seviva, it was the Ratzon Hashem that my neshama needed those experiences, and I am mechuyev in my avodah to take from those experiences and not be ashamed of it, but to say that is what gives me the unique quality I have to serve the Ribbon Shalom. Most people here remember the great Mir Rosh Hashiva of Nosson Tzvi Finkel, Zechreinu Livracha. Great tzaddik, and Baruch Hashem, he grew up in a very religious family, but he did have, for a Rosh Hashiva, at least in Eretz Yisrael, a bit of an unconventional upbringing. He went to Jewish schools, but they were co-ed schools, and he was on the debating team, and he was on the high school basketball team, and it was a co-ed school. Not too many Rosh Hashivas of Mir come from that particular environment. And I remember at the Hespedim that the basic yesod of the Hespedim was, you see that even a person who came from such a garbage background could achieve godless and greatness. And that's 100% true, valid point. But I think you have to add to the point a little bit. His greatness was not only in spite of his background, part of his greatness was because of his background. Everyone knows Reb Nosson Tzvi's amazing ability to interact with every American teenage kid who came from anywhere. Because he basically said, oh yeah, the basketball team, I was there. Yeah, I did all that. And that hashpah came precisely because the Eibishter put him in a matzav where he grew up with all of those different things. So he could be a guide and a madrich. The point I'm making, therefore, is, this goes back to Yifas Tayr, that the Iker Tshuva, the highest level of Tshuva, the healthiest level of Tshuva, is one in which you integrate your experiences and your family and your talents, not by destroying them and amputating them, which would have been the Milchemes Mitzvah way of doing it, but through the Milchemes Rishus. Now, how does this tie in to the issue I identified on second level Kiruv? Because you see, a lot of the malaise that a person feels when they eventually leave the Kaisley Beis HaMedrash and start families is because if they had to cut adrift all of those different nekudos in their life, that gave them chizuk, and then gave them joy, and that gave them fulfillment. And if the message was, it's puzzle, treif, chazer, get rid of it. So Baruch Hashem, maybe as long as they're in the Kaisley Beis HaMedrash, they have shmira, they have compensations, they have all sorts of things. When they get out into the cold, cruel world, they find themselves cut adrift. So in many, many ways, this is why you sometimes find, even in the Ilama Shel Torah, which you might call, and this is not lav dafka among Bali Tshuva, it's even among people who are not the Chozrei B'Tshuva, which you might call a low-level, subclinical depression. Low level, meaning to say it's not an official psychological problem, but people feel they're cut off from something. There is something in them that's not being addressed. There is something in them that wants to come out that is not being allowed to come out. That has many, many, many effects later that can come out in many, many different ways. So I do recognize that I'm not giving necessarily any answers, but all I'm saying is that we need to understand. Eizeyu Chacham, Halo made mikol adam, right? Who is wise? You learn from everybody, but one of the Hasidic interpretations, Halo made mikol adam, you have to learn from the entire person. You have to look at the entire personality of a person and try to build up a person in the totality of his being and not pushing them to deny or to cut off. Now, in some ways, Rav Hutner was once criticized. Rav Hutner was a long time ago, but when the genre of Gedolim biographies began to come out, 60s and 70s, so Rav Hutner famously had some tinus on the biographies of Gedolim, because he said, what type of picture do you have? Every biography is the same. When he was 4 years old, he finished Bavli. When he was 5 years old, he finished Yerushalmi. Kisvei Hari by the age of 12. In other words, you're looking at phenomenal genius, unbelievable hasmada, wonder stories, miracle stories. Again, our miracles are not the miracles of doing maifsim, but miracles in limud, in hasmada, in shekeda, in yediyah satayra. And of course, you live in Yerushalayim, you don't need to read books. You have living representatives of this. But Rav Hutner Tainet, although it's a wonderful thing to see how great a person can become, but for most of us, we don't get a message there. Because how can I imitate that? I'm not going to know Bavli when I'm 4 years old. I already, missed that a long time ago. and my children too. So you're reading stories of greatness and godless and unbelievable, and there is no shaykhs to you. So Rav Hutner's solution, which raises some halachic issues of Lashon Hara, is that we have to understand that Gedolim too had their struggles. They had their doubts. They had their problems. We know the Chafetz Chaim, when he was already 70s and 80s, how he trained himself to fall asleep when you spoke Lashon Hara. But what was the Chafetz Chaim's nisayon when he was 15 years old? And Rav Hutner pointed out that sometimes looking at the struggles of the Adam Gadol, and even the occasional failure of the Adam Gadol, Sheva Yipol Tzaddik V'Kam, the Tzaddik falls 7 times and gets up, could be much more inspirational than the unbroken successes. Again, whether la halacha, you could write such a biography. It does raise issues of Lashon Hara. It's not a pasha thing. Can you talk about, if you're aware of different nefilas and the like? But there's another taina. I want to be meisef on Rav Hutner. I have another taina on some of the Gedolim biographies. And that is, by properly emphasizing tremendous godless in Torah, they sometimes combine it with maisim that suggest that other parts of life are not important. Such as, this gadol didn't even know the name of his children. This gadol only spoke to his wife 2 minutes a week. Now, lefi the madrega of the gadol, that's what the gadol does. Rabbi Akiva and his wife had an arrangement that he would go away for 24 years. But the danger is, I'm an avrech, and I read that this so-and-so didn't know the birthdays of his children. So, I don't have to celebrate my son's birthday. This gadol only talked to his wife 1 minute a week because, again, that was the madrega that the bias lived on. That's the way I'm going to live. That becomes a churban. That becomes a churban. What becomes an avodah tamima when it's done by a person who is a Baal Madrega becomes a hashchasa and a churban when it's emulated by people who are not on that Madrega, or even if you're on that Madrega, if your wife is not on that Madrega. Because you can't be tzaddikim on somebody else's cheshbon, as Rav Yisrael Salanter said. Any situation with Rabbi Akiva, any situation you want, is always talking about they are both Balei Madrega that are maskim to that type of life. So, as a result, we need to have biographies that tell different stories. And let me tell you some different stories that ought to be included in biographies. Story number 1 happened to me when I was 9 years old. Rav Moshe Feinstein, the Gadol Hador, used to visit Hartford, Connecticut. He had a relative in Hartford, Connecticut for 2 weeks in the summer. And our joke used to be, he wanted to go to the only place in the world that would not ask him any shilas for 2 weeks. So Hartford was a good place for that. And I was in 4th grade, and I was zocheh to be in the car that would take him to Minyan every morning. And I still remember, I had never seen it. I remember the Hadras Panim to this day, and I remember how he would even be learning Mishnayos and would be wrapping up his tefillin. I mamash had never seen such a thing in my life. But I would go to shul in the morning, and then I would walk to school that was 2 blocks away. And one day it was raining, I was still in shul, and he had already left. And 10 minutes later, there was a knock at the door, and the driver came and said, Rav Moshe remembered you were in the car. He asked me to come back and take you to school because he didn't want you to walk in the rain. Now, I didn't care. It was only 2 blocks away. I didn't care about walking in the rain. I still don't care about walking in the rain. And the guy who drove, who knew me for 10 years, it didn't occur to him there was a problem. So who was the one that thought about it? The Gadol Hador, who didn't waste a minute. Somebody asked Rav Moshe, how does he know every prima Gadim? So he said, Rav Moshe said, well, he said it modestly, if you reviewed it 600 times, it sticks in your head. So Rav Moshe learned every second, writing, learning. And yet, that's not a stira. And you should know that what a hashpah that has on me now. This is more than 50 years later, that I remember the godless of a person, how the Gadol Hador cared about a child in the 4th grade. We have Rav Steinman, and there are many, many stories about Rav Steinman. But this is a story that the Rosh Yeshiva sent me about a boy in Bnei Brak, Bnei Brak, from a frum family, unfortunately went totally off the derech. And he was going to marry a guy. That's a hard thing to do in Israel. It's not even that easy. In America, it's easy to do. He was going to marry a shiksa. And his uncle convinced him that he should at least go to his parents and have a final conversation with them to tell them what his plans are. And he came for Shabbos, and the whole Shabbos, Friday night, he was smoking on the Merpesa. And Shabbos day, he was on his iPhone, 2 Isurim, Chil Shabbos and iPhone, right? And in the afternoon, the father said, and why the father had such a havamin is amazing. He said to his son, listen, I'm going to a shir from Rav Aaron Lev. Want to come to the shir? Why would he even think of asking such a question? And the boy said, yeah, I'll go to the shir. Afterwards, he brings him over to the Rosh Yeshiva, to Rav Aaron Lev. And Rav Aaron Lev, and he mentions that, unfortunately, my son is no longer shomer mitzvahs. So Rav Steinman says to him, okay, has there ever been, how many years have you not kept Shabbos? He says, 2 years. During those 2 years, has there been any time that you've thought of doing tshuva? He says, yeah. How many times? 4 times. And how long would you hear her tshuva? 10 minutes. So Steinman said, so over the past 2 years, you had 40 minutes where you were a Baal Tshuva. And Chazal say, the place where a Baal Tshuva stands is greater than that of a tzaddik. I'm jealous of you. That was part 1. Part 2 is, the father asked his son, why did you even come with me? I don't know why I asked you, why did you even come with me? So he said, well, if it wouldn't have been Rav Steinman, I wouldn't have come. But when I was in Kita Daled, when I was in 4th grade, in Cheder, our whole class went to get a bechina from Rav Aaron. And he was told to ask easy questions. We're 4th graders. And he asked very easy questions, and everybody answered the questions, and they got a candy. Then he asked me a question, and I couldn't answer. And then he asked me a second question, an easier question I couldn't answer. Then he asked me a third question I couldn't answer. I was really embarrassed. Everybody else answered, and they got candies. At the end, everybody went away, and Rabbi Lev gave me 3 candies. And he said, you know, in Torah, what matters is not your success. What matters is the effort, the ma'amatz. Everybody put in a ma'amatz to answer 1 question, they get 1 candy. You put in a ma'amatz to answer 3 questions, you get 3 candies. So he gave him 3 candies. And the Bachar said that all of his life he remembered that, and although he drifted off the derech, but together with the shir, he became a real chayzer b'tshuva, is now a shomer mitzvahs. Rav Chaim Ozer Godzensky. Rav Chaim Ozer, also the Gadol Hador, not a charismatic speaker. He very rarely spoke in public. He was not in the kiruv business. But I know of at least 1 Baal Tshuva that he made. Rav Chaim Ozer, during the war years, he only died in 1940, but in the early years of the war, handled literally millions and millions and millions of dollars that had to be distributed to the refugees in different places. And there was a representative of HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and the Joint Distribution Committee after World War I, a Dr. Schmitz, who was a non-religious Jew, and he needed to talk to Rav Chaim Ozer about distributing different funds to refugee communities. And they're talking about the details for a while. And at some point, Rav Chaim Ozer puts his hands on Dr. Schmitz's hand and says, do you mind if I call you Reb Shmuel? And Dr. Schmitz started crying. He says, you know, I'm a Machal Shabbos. I don't keep Shabbos. I eat treif. I don't deserve the Rav to call me Reb. Reb is a title of honor. And Rav Chaim Ozer said to him, what do you mean? Do you think you're not worthy in the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? That you left the comforts of America, you put yourself in a war zone in order to save other Jews? Do you think that doesn't make you worthy of respect? Do you think that does not make you worthy of being a Reb? And he said, I'm going to call you Reb Shmuel because you're doing something worthy with your life. And Dr. Schmidt records that afternoon he went home, he put on tefillin for mincha, and he became a shomer mitzvahs from that one conversation. We need biographies that tell us these stories. We need it for our own chizuk. We need it to teach us how to be mashpia on others, how to raise our own children, how to teach talmidim, that nobody becomes better in avodas Hashem unless they have a sense that they are fundamentally good and worthy. Because if the message a person gets is that they are worthless, that does not energize them to change. It either creates anger and resentment, or it creates yiyush and hopelessness. But you build a person up, and you show them the value of their avodah, then indeed they will move on to higher and higher levels. So, B'Yezras Hashem, I hope HaKadosh Baruch Hu will give us the kayach to move in that direction, and we be zeicha to the binyan Beis HaMikdash from here of Yamin.